A single moment tore through the stillness, sharp, uninvited, impossible to ignore. And in its wake, the air inside those polished walls shifted. It wasn't loud. It wasn't violent. Yet it carried the weight of a challenge no one had dared make in years. The people in that house had lived by unspoken codes, guarded by money, reinforced by fear, but something in that instant pressed against those codes until they strained. It would start as a quiet fracture and grow into something far more dangerous, shattering reputations, stripping away illusions, and dragging a dynasty into the light. When the last line was crossed, no one would look at the family or the truth the same way again. Hit like, subscribe, and drop in the comments what you think will unfold and where you're watching from, because the storm this sets off will not leave anything standing. Elena Brooks had learned the art of moving quietly through grand houses, a survival skill built over years of cleaning rooms where no one wanted to hear her footsteps. But the grand estate turned that habit into a necessity, a cathedral of glass and marble perched over the city, with hallways that carried sound like rumor and windows that reflected every flaw back at you. She had been here only 3 weeks, hired to keep the place immaculate and to tend to small duties around the nursery when asked, though the contract never called her a nanny, and she knew better than to claim a title that could be used against her. Even so, morning after morning, she found herself in the same sunlit room with the same small child who could not be soothed by clocks, mobiles, or any expensive gadget money could buy. On this particular dawn, the sky was the color of watered milk and Sophie's cries tore through the quiet like an alarm, sharp and panicked, the sound a baby makes when the world feels too large. Elena lifted the girl and settled onto the rug, crossing her legs and letting the rhythm of her own breathing set a pace Sophie could match. She hummed without words, the tune her grandmother used on nights when too many sirens raced past their window, and she kept the girl close enough that the tiny heartbeat could find hers and borrow its steadiness. Slowly, almost stubbornly, the sob softened. The little hands unclenched. The room, which had felt brittle as ice, began to feel warm again. Just as the child's eyelids drooped, the nursery door snapped open with the violent certainty of a slammed gavel. Alexander Grant stood in the doorway, in a white shirt still creased from the hanger, jaw set like a locked safe, the look of a man accustomed to issuing orders and being obeyed before the echo faded. "What do you think you're doing?" he demanded, the words cutting the air as cleanly as a blade. Sophie startled and whimpered. Elena didn't flinch, not outwardly. She wouldn't stop, she said, keeping her voice level so the sound wouldn't shake the baby back into panic. "I'm settling her." "You don't hold her like that," he snapped, stepping into the room as if proximity alone could enforce his authority. "You're the help. You keep things neat. You do not presume." The words were not new to Elena, but the sting of them still found tender places, the way salt finds a cut. Before she could answer, he reached down and took Sophie from her arms with a sharp, practiced motion. The baby's face went from drowsy to frantic in an instant. The cry that followed was not merely protest, but distress, a raw sound that made the framed photographs on the wall feel like witnesses. Alexander's expression flickered, confusion, irritation, and he bounced the child awkwardly, murmuring her name, promising quiet that did not arrive. The more he tried, the more Sophie arched and wailed, the small body turning rigid as a bow. Elena rose to her feet, hands open at her sides. She had learned long ago that some truths had to be spoken plainly or the moment would pass and calcify into something worse. "Give her back to me," she said, calm but unmistakably direct. "She's frightened. You're making it louder." He shot her a look that dared her to repeat herself, the kind of look that made junior partners lose promotions and contractors lose bids. She met it without blinking. For a second, his posture softened, and she saw not the billionaire or the boss, but a father who did not know what his child wanted. That thin crack was enough. He surrendered Sophie into Elena's arms, and the change happened as quickly as the storm had come. The scream folded into a sob, the sob into a hiccup, the hiccup into a breath. The baby tucked her face against Elena's collarbone and went boneless as sleep reclaimed her. Alexander stared as if someone had switched the physics of the room. Elena sank onto the rug again and rocked gently, the motion as old as caregiving itself. Silence returned in layers. He did not apologize. He did not speak. He stood there until his certainty had nothing left to feed on, then turned and left as suddenly as he had arrived, the door closing with a soft click that sounded, to Elena, like a withheld verdict. That evening the house was a study in restraint. Lights at half glow, footsteps muted by rugs thick as moss, staff moving in practiced orbits that avoided collision with their employer. Elena finished her duties and returned to the small bedroom tucked behind the service corridor. But sleep refused her. When she closed her eyes, she heard again the crack of the door, the serrated tone in his voice, the quick return of quiet once Sophie was back against her chest. She tried to catalog the day like a checklist, laundry complete, silver polished, flowers refreshed, but the memory of that moment sat outside any column, a problem that could not be balanced by arithmetic. She told herself what she always did when the world turned cold. You are here for the child. Not for the man with the clipped voice and the restless eyes. Not for his rules, his guests, his reputation. Elena assumed it was coincidence, that Sophie's little body was simply adjusting to routine, but it became impossible to ignore when, on the third night, Sophie began to wail the moment Elena stepped out of sight, the cries cutting through the thick carpeted halls and sending a subtle ripple through the household. The staff started to notice. There were sidelong glances in the kitchen, a kind of unspoken acknowledgement that Elena had become something more than her job description, though no one dared say it aloud where Alexander might hear. For his part, Alexander seemed to hover at a distance, his expression unreadable, sometimes appearing in the doorway of the nursery late at night, as if trying to understand the physics of why his own daughter calmed instantly in another woman's arms. He never stayed long enough to ask. On the fourth night, the storm broke. It was past midnight, the city lights turning the frost on the windows into scattered gold, and Sophie was deep in sleep against Elena's shoulder. Elena was too tired to think about much beyond the weight of a child in her arms and the slow rise and fall of her breathing when the nursery door opened without a knock. Alexander stepped in, quieter than usual, but the tension in his shoulders made him seem larger somehow. He stood there for a moment before speaking, his voice low, but carrying the same authority it always did. "She only sleeps with you," he said, as if stating a fact he had been resisting. Elena didn't answer right away. She adjusted Sophie slightly, pulling the blanket higher around her. "She needs consistency," Elena said finally. "She needs to know she's safe." "I was wrong the other morning," he said, the words clipped but deliberate, as if he had rehearsed them and disliked how they felt in his mouth. Elena looked up, surprised, not because she believed him incapable of apology, but because she hadn't expected it so soon. "I spoke out of anger," he continued. "I thought I was protecting her, but I was only making it worse." Elena let the silence stretch between them, measuring his sincerity. "You don't need to apologize to me," she said at last. "I'm here for Sophie, not for you, not for your approval." Something in his expression tightened, but he didn't argue. Instead, he stepped closer, looking at his daughter as if seeing her for the first time in days. Sophie shifted slightly, one small hand curling into Elena's sweater, but she didn't wake. "She's different with you," Alexander said quietly, almost to himself. "Maybe because I'm not afraid of her tears," Elena replied. "Maybe because I'm not trying to control her every breath." The words hung in the air, and for a moment she thought she had pushed too far, but Alexander only nodded, his gaze still fixed on Sophie. "I'd like you to keep doing whatever it is you're doing," he said. "If it works, it works." Elena didn't respond to that. She simply rocked the child gently, watching as the man who had stormed into this room days ago now stood uncertain in its soft lamplight. After a moment, he turned and left, closing the door with a care she hadn't seen from him before. The days that followed were subtly different. Alexander didn't stop being authoritative, but the sharpness in his interactions with Elena dulled slightly, replaced with a cautious respect that neither of them spoke about. He began checking in, not on her, but on Sophie at odd hours, sometimes lingering in the doorway, without saying a word. He seemed to notice details now, the way Sophie's breathing slowed when Elena hummed, the way she reached for Elena's necklace when falling asleep, the way her face relaxed completely only in that embrace. At the same time, Elena began to understand the shape of Alexander's life a little better. She overheard snippets of conversations, calls taken in low tones, discussions about board meetings, an upcoming charity gala. And she saw the way he carried himself in the presence of others, all certainty and precision, a man built from discipline. But in the nursery, he was something else, hesitant, uncertain, as though fatherhood was a language he was still learning to speak. One evening, after Sophie had drifted off in her crib without needing to be held for more than a few minutes, Elena stepped into the hallway to find Alexander waiting. "You've made this house quieter," he said, not as a compliment but as an observation. "Babies cry," Elena answered, "but they don't cry forever if you listen." He nodded slowly, as though filing the thought away, then stepped aside to let her pass. Staff moved with choreographed precision, placing silverware just so, adjusting candles to exact heights, and Elena, though assigned primarily to the nursery, was drawn into the rush of preparation, helping with last-minute arrangements before retreating upstairs to keep Sophie company while the guests arrived. Sophie was in a particularly restless mood that evening, teething and cranky, her soft fussing escalating into full-blown cries every time Elena stepped more than 2 feet away. Elena carried her through the quiet halls, murmuring lullabies under her breath, knowing full well that in a house this size sound traveled, and that somewhere below the hum of conversation was beginning to build. She hoped Sophie would be asleep before Alexander noticed. That hope shattered when Mrs. Langford appeared at the nursery door, looking unusually tense. "Mr. Grant wants you downstairs," she said. "Now." Elena frowned. With Sophie, the housekeeper's pause was all the answer she needed. She adjusted Sophie's blanket and descended the sweeping staircase, aware of the glitter of eyes from the dining room as she passed, aware too of the awkwardness of entering such a setting with a restless toddler in her arms. Alexander stood at the head of the table, mid-conversation with a man in an expensive suit, but his attention flicked instantly to Sophie's whimpers. "She won't settle," he said, his tone clipped, as though the admission cost him something. "I thought you could," he trailed off, gesturing vaguely. Elena didn't waste time. She shifted Sophie into a more comfortable position, swaying slightly as she whispered a few calming words, letting her voice fall into the same steady rhythm that worked in the nursery. Within moments, the cries softened to a quiet hum, then to nothing. Sophie's head rested on her shoulder, her small body melting into stillness. The change was visible, audible, almost tangible. The table of guests, mid-bite and mid-sentence, paused long enough to notice, and the air shifted. The tension that had been creeping up Alexander's jaw seemed to ease, just barely, as his daughter's piece restored the rhythm of the evening. "Impressive," one guest murmured, not quite quietly enough, and another asked if Elena was Sophie's nanny. Before Alexander could answer, Elena spoke, her voice polite but firm. "I take care of her when she needs me." It was both true and intentionally vague, enough to deflect without inviting further questions. Alexander gave a small nod, as if approving the deflection. He resumed his place at the table, introducing Elena by name but without title, and she took that as her cue to retreat. Still, she could feel the eyes following her as she exited, the mix of curiosity and respect that came from witnessing something they didn't quite understand. Back in the nursery, Elena laid Sophie in her crib, the faint hum of conversation from downstairs filtering up through the floor. She sat in the rocker for a moment longer than necessary, thinking about what had just happened. In the unspoken rules of houses like this, moments like that carried weight. They could shift hierarchies, alter perceptions, open doors, or close them. Later, when the party was over and the staff moved like shadows clearing the remains of the night, Elena passed through the kitchen to fetch a warm bottle for Sophie's next feeding. 2 of the younger maids were huddled by the counter, whispering, their voices dropping as she approached. One gave her a quick, almost apologetic glance, while the other didn't bother to hide her curiosity. He called her down in front of everyone. One murmured when they thought she was out of earshot. Like she's, the rest was lost to the clink of glasses, but Elena didn't need to hear it. She knew the staff would talk. They always did. The difference was in the tone. Some would see it as a breach of formality, others as a sign of unusual trust. Either way, it marked her as something other than invisible. Alexander didn't address the incident directly until the following afternoon. He appeared in the nursery doorway as Elena was stacking Sophie's toys into a wicker basket, the late winter sunlight spilling in across the carpet. "About last night," he began, and she looked up, waiting. "I appreciate what you did. I should have handled it myself," but he glanced toward Sophie, who was babbling contentedly on the floor. "It was better that you did." Elena nodded, accepting the words without embellishment. She was tired. That's all. "That's not all," he countered, his tone thoughtful rather than defensive. "She trusts you in a way she doesn't trust anyone else, even me." She reached for the thermometer, her hand steady even as her mind began to run through possibilities, teething fevers, a common cold, something worse. The reading came back high, and a faint unease curled in her stomach. She knew enough to keep her calm. Sophie would feel it if she didn't. She dampened a cloth with cool water, laying it across the child's brow, humming softly in the dim nursery light. By the time Alexander appeared at the doorway, hair rumpled and shirt half-buttoned, Sophie's breathing was uneven, each inhale catching. "What's wrong with her?" he demanded, his voice tight, betraying something that sounded dangerously close to fear. "Fever," Elena said simply. "We keep her hydrated, keep her cool, and watch her closely. If it spikes any higher, we call the doctor." He moved closer, his eyes flicking between Sophie's flushed cheeks and Elena's calm expression, as if measuring which one to trust more. "Call him now," he ordered, and she did, her voice low and precise as she relayed the symptoms. The pediatrician's arrival was delayed by the snow, but his instructions over the phone matched Elena's approach. Fluids, cool compresses, watch for changes. Alexander stayed in the room, pacing at first, then sitting beside the crib as though proximity might make a difference. But when Sophie began to whimper again, it was Elena she reached for. Without hesitation, Elena lifted her, cradling her in a position that allowed her chest to expand more easily, her hand moving in slow circles against the child's back. Alexander watched, his expression unreadable, but his eyes followed every small motion. Hours passed like that, Sophie dozing fitfully, Elena holding her, Alexander hovering close enough to feel the heat radiating from both of them. Once, around 3 in the morning, Elena glanced up to find him standing by the window, his hands clasped behind his back, staring out at the snow as though it could give him answers. "You're good at this," he said quietly, not turning around. "It's not about being good," she replied. "It's about being here." He finally looked at her, and something in his gaze softened, the sharpness replaced by a reluctant respect. "Most people panic when a child is sick," he said. "You don't." Elena shifted Sophie slightly, feeling the small chest rise and fall. "I don't have the luxury to panic. She needs calm more than anything right now." Around dawn, the fever broke. Sophie's skin cooled, her breathing evened, and she drifted into a deeper, more restful sleep. Elena laid her gently in the crib, smoothing the blanket over her, while Alexander exhaled a breath he might have been holding all night. "Thank you," he said, and the words were bare, without formality or guardedness. "You're welcome," she answered, just as simply. She didn't look at him long. The moment felt fragile, something that would lose its truth if examined too closely. The doctor arrived later that morning, checking Sophie over and confirming it was nothing more than a seasonal virus, aggravated by the dry winter air. He left instructions and a promise to follow up, and the house began to hum again with its usual quiet efficiency. But Alexander lingered in the nursery long after the visit, his presence more subdued than usual, as if the night had drawn a line he couldn't quite step back over. The rest of the day passed in a haze of recovery. Elena stayed close to Sophie, reading softly from a picture book when she was awake, letting the child's small fingers curl around hers as she dozed. She noticed Alexander passing the doorway more than once, sometimes pausing, sometimes just looking in briefly before moving on. When evening came and Sophie was asleep for the night, Elena gathered her things to leave the nursery, only to find Alexander waiting in the hallway. "I was wrong," he said without preamble. About everything, really. You're not just good with her. You're what she needs." Elena studied him for a moment, the sincerity in his tone undeniable. "I'm here for her," she said again. The same words she'd used before, but this time they landed differently, like a truth he couldn't argue with. He nodded, stepping aside to let her pass, and she walked away without looking back, her mind replaying the night's events, the fear in his voice, the way he'd watched her, the strange sense that he'd seen her not just as an employee, but as something more essential. That night, as she lay in her narrow bed, Elena thought about how easily the entire night could have gone differently if she hadn't known what to do. The air outside still carried the sharp edge of winter, though the snow had begun to recede into shallow drifts along the sidewalks, leaving behind patches of wet pavement that reflected the pale sunlight. Elena was in the nursery, folding a fresh stack of blankets, when Alexander appeared in the doorway, wearing a dark wool coat and a scarf draped neatly at his collar. His expression was neutral, but his tone carried a note she hadn't heard before, something almost careful. "I want you to come with us this afternoon," he said. "Sophie's visiting the Children's Hospital for a charity event. It's important she's calm and she does better with you." Elena paused, folding the last blanket before setting it aside. "You have staff who handle these things," she said evenly, not refusing but making him articulate the reason. "Not like you," he replied simply, and that ended the discussion. 2 hours later, she found herself in the back of the black SUV, Sophie strapped into her car seat beside her, a small knit cap pulled low over her ears. The driver navigated through the city streets, while Alexander worked silently on his phone, the muted click of the keys punctuating the quiet. Occasionally, Sophie would make a soft sound, and Elena would lean over, adjusting her blanket or offering a toy, each gesture met with a kind of instinctive trust that had become second nature between them. The hospital loomed ahead, its brick facade softened by age, the entrance decorated with winter wreaths and a scattering of volunteers holding clipboards. Cameras were set up outside, local news, Elena guessed. And as soon as the SUV rolled to a stop, Alexander was stepping out, his public face in place, polished and poised. He extended a hand to help Elena out, a gesture so unexpected she hesitated before taking it. The cameras didn't miss the sight of him holding Sophie briefly before passing her to Elena, the child's small head resting contentedly on her shoulder. Inside, the scent of antiseptic mingled with the faint sweetness of holiday decorations. Nurses greeted Alexander warmly, guiding the small entourage to a brightly lit playroom where a group of young patients waited, their eyes wide with excitement. Alexander moved with practiced ease, kneeling to speak to a boy in a wheelchair, shaking hands with parents, signing a poster for the hospital's fundraiser. But Sophie, perhaps sensing the unfamiliar environment, clung tightly to Elena, her fingers curling in the fabric of her sweater. "She'll warm up," Elena murmured, keeping her voice low, and sure enough, after a few minutes of watching from the safety of her arms, Sophie began to reach toward a stack of plush toys on a nearby table. Elena carried her over, letting her pick a small stuffed bear, and the moment Sophie accepted it, one of the hospital photographers captured the image, a candid scene of comfort that felt out of place in the otherwise staged atmosphere. Alexander noticed. From across the room, his gaze met Elena's, and something unspoken passed between them. Not approval exactly, but acknowledgement, as though he saw the value in the ease she brought to situations like this. When it came time to leave, a nurse approached with a donation envelope, thanking Alexander for his generosity. "It's not just the money," she said with a smile. "Children remember kindness more than anything." Alexander inclined his head politely, but his glance slid toward Elena again, and for a fleeting second, she wondered if he was thinking about the difference between charity for show and care that left a mark. Outside, the cameras were waiting once more. The cold bit at Elena's cheeks as she stood beside Alexander, Sophie balanced on her hip. One of the reporters called out a question about the visit, and Alexander answered with smooth precision, speaking about the importance of community support and the hospital's work. When Sophie made a small noise and reached for Elena's necklace, one of the cameras swung toward them, catching the moment before she could step back. The image, she knew, would look like something more than it was. Back in the SUV, Sophie fell asleep quickly, her bear clutched tightly against her. Alexander sat across from them this time, his phone silent in his lap. "You handled that well," he said after a moment. She didn't cry once. Elena brushed a bit of lint from Sophie's coat. "She trusts me. That's all it is." "That's not all," he said quietly, and there was something in his tone that suggested he wasn't just talking about Sophie anymore. The rest of the ride passed in a silence that wasn't quite comfortable but wasn't tense either. When they returned to the estate, Alexander didn't retreat to his study immediately. Instead, he lingered in the nursery doorway as Elena laid Sophie in her crib, his eyes following the small, familiar motions: blanket, lullaby, a soft pat on the back. When she turned to leave, he spoke again, almost as if to himself. "Today would have gone differently without you." She didn't answer, but she carried the words with her, hearing them in the quiet long after he'd gone. That night, in the solitude of her room, Elena thought about the hospital visit, about the cameras, the children, the way Alexander's gaze had lingered. It was easy to dismiss the outing as a formality, just another task in her role, but she couldn't shake the sense that something had shifted. The sound of heels on marble followed, measured and unhurried, a cadence she didn't recognize. Voices carried upward, muffled at first, until a sharper tone cut through the air. Female, precise, and edged with disdain. Elena stepped into the hallway, her instinct to check on the source pulling her toward the grand staircase, though she kept to the shadows along the upper landing. Margaret Grant stood at the base of the stairs, tall and impeccably dressed in a charcoal coat with a fur collar, her expression cool as she addressed her brother. Alexander, hands in his pockets, stood with the kind of tension that suggested this was not their first disagreement. "I saw the news segment," Margaret said, her voice low but pointed. "The hospital visit. You let her stand beside you in front of the cameras. You let her hold Sophie while the press took photos." Alexander's jaw tightened. "She keeps Sophie calm," he replied. "That's what matters." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "That's not all that matters, and you know it. Appearances mean everything in this family, and having the help paraded around like, enough," Alexander cut in, the word sharp enough to halt her mid-sentence. "Elena is not a prop, and she's not just the help. She's the reason Sophie didn't cry once that day, and the reason Sophie has been sleeping through the night again." Margaret scoffed. "And what do you think people assume when they see her there? Do you care at all about the way this looks? About what people will say?" "I care about my daughter," Alexander said evenly, "and my daughter needs her." Elena felt the heat rise in her chest, the instinct to step forward and defend herself nearly overwhelming. But she stayed where she was, listening to the rhythm of the conversation, every word like a thread weaving a clearer picture of how precarious her place here truly was. Margaret's voice dropped, though the edge remained. "You're making a mistake. This attachment, it will complicate things." Alexander's reply was quieter, but no less firm. "It already has, and I'm fine with that." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Margaret's gaze lingered on her brother, searching for something she didn't find. And then she turned toward the door. "We'll talk again," she said, the words carrying both a warning and a promise, before sweeping out into the cold. Alexander stood there for several seconds after the door closed, his shoulders rigid. Then, as though sensing they were not alone, he glanced up toward the landing. Elena stepped back into the shadows before he could see her, her pulse quickening. She returned to the nursery, forcing her voice into an easy rhythm as she knelt beside Sophie, who was babbling to herself, oblivious to the tension that had just passed through the house. Later that afternoon, Alexander appeared in the nursery doorway, his expression unreadable. "My sister can be difficult," he said, as if that were an explanation. Elena looked up from where she was tucking Sophie into her crib for a nap. "She's worried about you," Elena said carefully. "And about Sophie. She's worried about appearances," he corrected. "That's different." Elena hesitated, then asked, "And what about you? Are you worried about them?" He shook his head, the faintest trace of a smile at the corner of his mouth. "No, I'm more concerned with reality than optics." She didn't press the matter, though part of her wanted to. Instead, she nodded and turned her attention back to Sophie, feeling the weight of the conversation settle over her like an invisible cloak. That evening, the staff seemed more watchful than usual, as though word of Margaret's visit had traveled quickly. In the kitchen, two of the maids fell silent when Elena entered, and the butler offered a polite but lingering glance that made her wonder what had been said in her absence. By the time she returned to her small room at the back of the house, her thoughts were looping through the morning's events, the sharpness in Margaret's voice, the steadiness in Alexander's defense, the unshakable truth that her role here was shifting in ways neither of them could fully control. She had been in this house long enough to know that loyalty could be both a shield and a target. If Alexander saw her as indispensable, others would see her as a threat, and the line between the two was thinner than she'd like to admit. Elena entered carrying Sophie, who was freshly bathed and dressed in a soft cream sweater and navy skirt, her hair tied back with a simple ribbon. She expected to place Sophie in the adjoining sitting room away from the guests, but Alexander's quiet instruction earlier had been clear. She was to stay, keep Sophie nearby, and make sure she was at ease. The first guests arrived promptly at 7. There were 4 of them, 2 men and 2 women, each dressed in tailored evening wear, their voices low, but carrying the easy confidence of people accustomed to influence. Alexander greeted them at the door, his charm effortless, and ushered them into the dining room, where place cards marked the seats. Elena noted with quiet surprise that an extra chair had been placed at the far end of the table near the high-backed armchair Sophie's booster seat now occupied. It was hers. Alexander made no announcement, no justification, simply gestured for her to sit as the others settled in. The first course was served by the household staff, who moved in practiced silence. Elena kept Sophie occupied with small bites of soft bread and sips of water, aware of the glances being cast her way. Most were polite, curious at best, but one, Mr. Hawthorne, a broad-shouldered man with silver hair and an expensive watch, lingered longer, as though measuring her against some internal standard. "And this is?" he asked at last, looking directly at Alexander. "Elena Brooks," Alexander said without hesitation. "She's here for Sophie's comfort." "Comfort," Mr. Hawthorne repeated, his brows lifting slightly. "I wasn't aware that sort of role included a place at the table." Alexander's smile didn't waver. "It does tonight." A faint ripple of tension passed down the table, but no one pressed the matter further. Conversation resumed, drifting toward market trends, foreign investments, and the shifting landscape of charitable tax laws. Elena listened without reacting, her attention on Sophie, though she caught enough to sense that the stakes for this dinner extended beyond simple hospitality. When the main course arrived, Sophie grew restless, sliding in her seat and reaching toward Elena. Without a word, Elena lifted her onto her lap, cutting small portions from her plate and feeding them between sips of her own wine. She felt the weight of eyes on her, but refused to let her movements betray any discomfort. "She trusts you," one of the women, Mrs. Calder, observed with a faint smile. "Children don't fake that." Elena inclined her head politely. "She's a good judge of character." Mrs. Calder's smile deepened, but it was Alexander's expression that caught her attention, something in his gaze acknowledging the subtle victory in the exchange. Dessert was served, warm pear tart with cream, and as the plates were cleared, Alexander leaned back in his chair, directing the conversation toward a local development project. Elena realized then that this dinner was not only about business, but about signaling something unspoken to these people. He wanted them to see her here, to understand without explanation that her role in Sophie's life, and perhaps his own, was non-negotiable. It was a gamble. Margaret's warning still echoed in her mind, and she wondered if this display was Alexander's way of defying it or testing its truth. When the guests finally rose to leave, coats retrieved and farewells exchanged. Mr. Hawthorne lingered at the door just long enough to glance back at her. "You carry yourself well," he said, the words neutral but not unkind. Elena offered a polite nod, unsure whether it was praise or simply acknowledgement of her endurance. The house fell quiet once the cars had disappeared down the long driveway. Elena took Sophie upstairs, tucking her into bed and smoothing the blanket over her small frame. As she turned to leave, Alexander was in the doorway, his tie loosened and his expression unreadable. "You handled yourself well tonight," he said. "They notice more than they admit." "And what do you want them to notice?" she asked, her voice low. He hesitated, then answered, "That you're part of this, whether they like it or not." There was no arrogance in his tone, only certainty, as if he had weighed the risks and found them worth taking. Elena met his gaze for a moment before stepping past him, the echo of his words following her down the hall. In her room, the scent of roses from the dining table seemed to cling to her clothes, a reminder of the strange, delicate battle she had just fought without ever raising her voice. She knew the dinner would be talked about in circles beyond these walls, each retelling colored by opinion, bias, and agenda. Below, it was the photo from a hospital, the one of Elena holding Sophie while Alexander stood slightly behind them, speaking to a nurse. The article began innocuously enough, praising Alexander's charitable contributions, but quickly shifted to a tone that questioned the optics of his decision to bring a member of his household staff into such a visible role. It referred to her only as the caretaker, never by name, and while it made no explicit accusations, the choice of language, unconventional, provocative, raising eyebrows, dripped with insinuation. There was a single sentence that made Elena's stomach tighten. In an age where public figures are expected to uphold certain standards, one wonders whether personal comfort has begun to outweigh propriety in the grand household. Alexander folded the paper deliberately, his movement slow, then slid it to the far end of the table as though to remove it from the room entirely. "It's not worth your attention," he said, but the hard set of his jaw betrayed his irritation. By midday, the staff had heard of it. In the kitchen, two housemaids spoke in low tones until they noticed Elena's presence, their eyes darting away. The butler's usual warmth was tinged with something more guarded, as if her mere proximity carried risk. That evening, Alexander's phone buzzed with messages, some from friends offering perfunctory support, others forwarding links to similar articles now appearing online. By the third day, talk radio hosts were speculating about the mystery woman in his life, their voices dripping with feigned curiosity and thinly veiled condescension. Elena avoided the internet entirely, but she didn't need to see the words to feel their sting. At the market, while picking up fresh fruit for Sophie, she overheard two women by the floral display whispering about that Maid in the papers. One of them glanced at her, eyes narrowing, before turning back to her companion. That night, as snow began to fall again outside, Alexander found her in the nursery, sitting on the floor with Sophie asleep against her chest. "They don't matter," he said, leaning against the doorframe. "They don't know you. They don't know us. But they think they do," she replied quietly. "And they'll keep talking because it's easier than asking the truth." He crossed the room and crouched beside her, lowering his voice. "Then let them talk. It won't change what you are to her." His eyes flicked to Sophie, the smallest smile softening his expression. "Or to me." The warmth of his words cut through some of the chill, but she knew this wasn't going away soon. The following morning, the fallout reached another level. Margaret called, not to speak to Elena, of course, but to Alexander. Her voice, audible even from where Elena passed the open office door, was laced with barely contained fury. "This is exactly what I warned you about," she snapped. "You've made her part of the story. You've given them the narrative they wanted, and now it's out of your hands." Alexander's reply was short, his tone steady but unyielding. It was never in their hands to begin with. The call ended abruptly, and for the rest of the day, the house felt heavier, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the tension. That evening, just before dinner, an email arrived from the hospital's communications director. They were receiving calls from donors asking about the nature of Elena's role, and while they expressed support, it was clear they were concerned about public perception. Alexander responded within minutes, making it clear that Elena's presence had been integral to Sophie's ability to participate and that any attempt to diminish her contribution would be both inaccurate and unacceptable. He didn't tell Elena the exact wording of his reply, but she caught a glimpse of the last line on the screen before he sent it. "If we start making decisions based on prejudice disguised as propriety, we've already failed the children we claim to serve." Later, as she prepared Sophie for bed, Elena found herself wondering at the strange shape of the alliance, forming between her and Alexander. They still spoke little outside of what was necessary, but when they did, it carried the weight of something shared, a quiet recognition that they were now defending the same ground. In her room that night, she sat on the edge of the bed, the glow of the small lamp casting long shadows on the wall. She thought about the hospital visit, the dinner, the stares, the whispers. She thought about how easily her life could be twisted into a story that wasn't hers, told by people who didn't know her voice. To Elena's shock, Alexander informs her she will be coming as well, not as staff, not as a caretaker, but as his official guest. The decision sends ripples through the household and beyond, setting the stage for a confrontation that will be anything but private. The afternoon the invitation arrives, Alexander finds Elena in the sunroom with Sophie, the child giggling as Elena rolls a small rubber ball across the rug. He doesn't speak right away, just stands in the doorway, envelope in hand, his expression caught between calculation and certainty. When he finally steps forward, his tone is matter-of-fact. "There's a gala next Saturday," he says. "Children's Health Foundation. I've confirmed we'll attend, and you'll be coming with us." For a moment, Elena thinks she's misheard him. She sits back, the ball rolling to a stop beside her knee. "With you? At the gala?" "As my guest," he clarifies, his gaze steady. "Not in the background. Not helping with Sophie in some corner. You'll be seated beside me." Her mind flashes instantly to the newspaper column, the whispers at the market, Margaret's sharp voice over the phone. "You know what they'll say," she murmurs. "I know," he replies almost too quickly. "And that's exactly why you're coming." The days leading up to the event are thick with unspoken tension. In the kitchen, one of the maids accidentally refers to Elena's big night before flushing and muttering an apology. The butler, always measured, offers a polite nod when she passes but says nothing. It's Margaret's arrival 2 days before the gala that turns the quiet unease into a storm. She doesn't wait to be shown in, just strides into Alexander's office, voice raised before the door even closes. "You're making a spectacle of yourself," she says, not bothering to sit. "First the hospital photo, then the dinner stunt, and now this? You're taking her into the most public, most scrutinized room in the city." Alexander leans back in his chair, unflinching. "I'm taking her where she belongs." Margaret's laugh is short and sharp. "Belongs? She's the help, Alexander. She's..." "Careful," he cuts in, his voice low but lethal. "If you finish that sentence the way I think you will, you can show yourself out and not come back." Margaret studies him for a long moment, the air between them taut, then shakes her head. "You have no idea what you're inviting into your life." She leaves without another word, her heels clicking hard against the marble. On the night of the gala, Elena stands before the mirror in the gown Alexander's assistant had arranged, a deep sapphire silk that schemes her frame, its simplicity offset by a single strand of pearls. Sophie, in a pale blue dress, toddles toward her, holding out a silver clip. Elena bends to fasten it in her own hair, feeling a sudden, almost absurd pang of gratitude for the child's small, unself-conscious approval. Downstairs, the car waits. The ride into the city is quiet, punctuated only by Sophie's occasional bursts of laughter. Outside the venue, a line of photographers stands behind velvet ropes, their cameras already flashing for arriving guests. The moment Alexander steps out, a murmur runs through the crowd, recognition, followed by surprise as Elena emerges with Sophie in her arms. Questions are shouted. Who is she? Is that your partner? But Alexander doesn't break stride, placing a hand at the small of Elena's back as they ascend the steps. Inside, the ballroom is a glittering expanse of chandeliers, crystal glassware, and polished wood floors. Conversations dip and swell, punctuated by laughter and the clink of champagne flutes. Their table is near the stage, directly in view of the press section. As they sit, Elena feels dozens of eyes on her, some openly curious, others cool and appraising. A woman at the next table leans toward her companion and whispers something that makes them both smirk. Elena keeps her expression neutral, focusing on helping Sophie with a small plate of fruit. The speeches begin, foundation leaders, donors, a brief video presentation about recent initiatives. When Alexander is called to the podium to accept an award for his contributions, the spotlight spills across their table. He speaks briefly about the importance of sustained support for children's health programs, his voice confident and clear. But then he pauses, glancing toward Elena. "This work isn't done in isolation," he says, the faintest smile in his voice. "It's done with the people who show up every day, who care enough to stay, who hold the most fragile lives with the strongest hands. Sophie and I are lucky to have that kind of person with us tonight." A ripple moves through the room. Surprise, curiosity, something else. Elena feels the heat rise in her cheeks, but keeps her gaze steady. The applause is polite but not warm, and she knows the whispers will resume as soon as the lights dim again. When Alexander returns to the table, there's a subtle shift in the air around them. Some guests are more cordial, introducing themselves to Elena with measured politeness. Others avoid eye contact entirely. As the evening winds down, a reporter approaches, microphone in hand. "Ms. Brooks," she says, the use of Elena's name startling in its precision. "How do you feel about being here tonight, given the recent public discussion?" Elena glances at Alexander, who inclines his head slightly, permission to speak. "I feel honored," Elena says evenly. "Honored to be part of Sophie's life and proud to stand beside someone who doesn't let public opinion decide what's right." The reporter nods, jotting something down before retreating. As they leave the ballroom, the photographers are still there, still calling questions, still snapping pictures. In the car, Sophie sleeps between them, her head resting on Elena's lap. Alexander doesn't speak until they're nearly home. "You handled yourself perfectly," he says quietly. They'll keep talking, but now they've seen you for themselves. By midday, the tension that had been simmering privately bursts into full flame when Margaret arrives at the estate unannounced, determined to confront both Alexander and Elena face to face. Elena is in the kitchen with Sophie, coaxing her to eat slices of apple, when she hears the sharp rhythm of heels on marble and the unmistakable edge in Margaret's voice calling her brother's name. The sound tightens her chest, but she stays calm, lifting Sophie into her arms before walking toward the great hall. Alexander is already there, standing with one hand in his pocket, watching as his sister shrugs off her coat and tosses it onto a chair. "You've lost your mind," Margaret says without preamble. "Do you even realize what you've done? You've made her the story. You've dragged our name into the kind of gossip you can't put back in the box." Alexander's tone is measured but cold. "Our name isn't so fragile it can't withstand a dinner table conversation, Margaret. And I haven't made her the story. Other people have. I'm not going to erase her just because they're uncomfortable." Margaret turns to Elena then, her eyes narrowing. "And you're enjoying this, aren't you? The attention, the speculation. Sitting in rooms you don't belong in." Elena's pulse hammers, but she refuses to drop her gaze. "I was invited," she says quietly but firmly, "and I belong wherever I'm needed for Sophie's well-being. If that happens to be a gala or a dinner table, then yes, I belong there." Margaret lets out a sharp laugh, the sound more cutting than amused. "You really think this is about the child? This is about you inching closer to something that isn't yours and will never be." Alexander steps forward then, his voice low but carrying enough force to still the air in the room. "Enough. You don't speak to her that way, not here, not anywhere." The silence that follows is brittle, like ice about to crack. Margaret's eyes flick between them, and for the first time, Elena senses something like realization in her expression, a recognition that whatever assumptions she's been making about Elena's role no longer fit neatly into the category of staff. "You're making a mistake, Alex," Margaret says finally, her voice softer but no less pointed. "When this falls apart, it won't just be you who pays the price. It'll be Sophie. And her." Without waiting for a reply, she grabs her coat and leaves, the front door closing behind her with a thud that echoes through the hall. The house is quiet again, but it's not the peaceful kind of quiet. It's the kind that feels heavy, like it's pressing down from the ceiling. Alexander runs a hand over his face, exhaling slowly, then looks at Elena. "I'm sorry," he says. "She shouldn't have spoken to you like that." Elena shakes her head. "I'm not fragile, Alexander. But I'm not blind either. She's not wrong about one thing. The more public this gets, the more it's going to cost. He meets her gaze, something unspoken passing between them. Then we'll pay it together. Later that afternoon, the ripple effects of the gala make themselves felt in other ways. Two of Alexander's business contacts call to express concern about the optics of his choices, their voices couched in politeness, but carrying the same underlying judgment. An email from a board member of one of his charities lands in his inbox, politely suggesting that he consider the narrative being created. Elena catches him reading it at his desk, his jaw tight, his fingers drumming against the wood. Without looking up, he says, "They think they're protecting me. They're really just protecting the rules they've built their comfort on." In the evening, after Sophie is asleep, Alexander pours 2 glasses of wine and joins Elena in the small library at the back of the house. The fire is low, the room smelling faintly of old paper and cedar. "You know," he says, handing her a glass, "this isn't just about you or me anymore. They've drawn the line. Now it's up to us whether we step over it or let them push us back." Elena studies him for a moment, the firelight catching in his eyes. "And if we step over it?" He smiles faintly, but it's a smile edged with steel. "Then we don't step back. Not ever." They sit in silence for a while, the crackle of the fire filling the space between them. Outside, the snow has begun again, soft flakes drifting past the tall windows. Elena takes a slow sip of wine, feeling the warmth spread through her chest. She thinks about Margaret's words, the articles, the whispers in the market, the stares at the gala. She thinks about how much of her life now exists in spaces she never imagined occupying, and how quickly those spaces can turn hostile. But she also thinks about the way Alexander's voice had cut through the tension earlier, the certainty in his tone when he told his sister to stop. It wasn't the voice of a man protecting an employee. It was the voice of a man drawing a boundary and daring anyone to cross it. By the time she finishes her glass, she knows that whatever comes next will test them both in ways they can't predict. But she also knows that she's no longer just reacting to the world being thrown at her. She's choosing to stand in it, to claim her place in it. Whether that place holds or collapses under the weight of public opinion is no longer entirely in her control, but the decision to remain there is. And as the fire burns low and Alexander leans back in his chair, watching her with that same steady gaze, she feels the faintest spark of something she hasn't felt in weeks. Not peace, exactly, but the beginnings of resolve. The tone is calculated, enough innuendo to suggest scandal, without stating anything directly defamatory. But the worst part isn't the details. It's the photograph splashed across the front page, a zoomed-in image of Elena in the supermarket, holding Sophie on her hip, unaware of the camera, her face turned toward the child in a moment of unguarded tenderness. The headline reads, "From maid to mistress? The woman behind the Grant family shake-up." Elena sees it first when she stops by the kitchen for coffee. The paper is lying on the counter, folded just enough for the headline to glare up at her like a dare. She doesn't touch it, but her pulse pounds in her ears. Mrs. Langford enters, notices her stare, and sweeps the paper into a drawer without comment. But the damage is done. The words are already carved into Elena's mind. Upstairs, Alexander is pacing in his office, phone pressed to his ear. His voice is low, but the sharp edges of his tone carry through the doorway. When Elena steps in, he ends the call abruptly. "You saw it," he says, not as a question, but as a fact. "I did," she answers. It's what they do. They dress up half-truths as reality and sell it like it's gospel. He moves toward her, his jaw tight. "I've already called the lawyers. We can threaten them with defamation, but they'll hide behind public interest and say it's all sourced. We'll end up feeding the story more." Elena studies him for a moment, noting the tension in his shoulders. "So what then? We just let them decide who I am." His eyes meet hers, steady and unblinking. "No, we decide who you are, and we make them listen." The rest of the day, the estate becomes a fortress. Calls come in from journalists looking for comment. They're turned away. Emails flood in, some hateful, some supportive, all unsolicited. A security guard is posted at the front gate after an unfamiliar car is spotted lingering on the road. Sophie senses the shift, growing clingier, her small hands gripping Elena's shirt whenever she tries to set her down. By evening, the pressure inside the house feels unbearable. Alexander finds Elena in the nursery, the dim light casting long shadows across the room. "There's a way to answer this," he says quietly. "A way that doesn't involve lawyers or denials. But it has to be your choice." She turns from the window. "What is it?" "We do an interview," he says. "One outlet. On our terms. No gotcha questions, no ambush. You tell your story, your actual story, not the one they've made up." Elena considers this, her instinct warring with her exhaustion. "You think they'll listen to me? I think they'll listen if I'm sitting beside you." The idea hangs between them, heavy with risk. She knows what stepping into that kind of spotlight means. More scrutiny, more opinion, more strangers thinking they know her. But she also knows what staying silent does. It lets others fill the silence with whatever they please. That night, she lies awake, replaying the last few months in her mind. The first day she arrived at the estate. The first time Sophie fell asleep in her arms. Alexander's words at the gala. Margaret's glare. The cruel neatness of the headline this morning. Somewhere between midnight and dawn, her decision hardens. In the morning, she finds Alexander in the study and says, "If we're doing this, we're doing it right. I'm not going to defend myself like I've done something wrong. I'm going to tell them who I am and why I'm here." He nods, already dialing his publicist. The interview is set for the end of the week, with a respected journalist known for long-form human interest profiles. Word of the arrangement leaks almost instantly, fueling another round of speculation online. Some frame it as a desperate attempt to rehabilitate Elena's image. Others accuse Alexander of staging a performance. But inside the estate, the mood shifts from siege to preparation. The day before the interview, Alexander's assistant walks Elena through potential questions. But Elena refuses to rehearse her answers. "If I'm going to do this," she says, "I'm not going to sound like I'm reading from script. They'll smell it from a mile away." The morning of the interview, the crew arrives early, 2 camera operators, a sound technician, the journalist herself. They set up in the library, the fire lit, the winter light filtering through tall windows. Sophie stays with Mrs. Langford upstairs, her laughter occasionally drifting down the hall like a reminder of what all this is for. When the cameras roll, the journalist starts gently, asking about Elena's work with Sophie, her daily life before and after joining the household. Elena answers steadily, keeping her voice even, her gaze direct. Then the questions turn sharper, about the gala, the public reaction, the insinuations in the tabloids. Alexander watches her closely, ready to step in if needed, but she doesn't falter. "People can think what they want," she says at one point. "I can't control that. What I can control is the truth I live in every day, that I care for this child like she's my own, that I take pride in the work I do, and that my worth isn't determined by where I was born or how I make my living." The journalist nods, letting the words settle before moving on. When the interview ends, there's a quiet in the room that feels different from the silence after Margaret's departure or the hush of a tense dinner. This one feels earned. The crew packs up, the journalist thanking them both before leaving. Alexander turns to Elena, his expression unreadable for a moment before he says, "You did more than answer them." Some are from old friends and neighbors offering encouragement, others from complete strangers thanking her for speaking openly. But wedged between the kindness are messages dripping with venom, accusing her of everything from manipulation to gold digging. Some so while she stops reading. Downstairs, Alexander is already on the phone with his publicist, pacing the study while a half-empty coffee cup sits forgotten on the desk. His tone is clipped, controlled, but there's an edge of irritation under every word. "We expected criticism," he says, "but we didn't expect coordinated attacks. I want names. I want to know where it's coming from." He hangs up when Elena steps in, giving her a look that blends concern and something sharper, determination. "It's not just random trolls," he says. There are PR firms pushing certain stories to make you look like a threat. Elena doesn't flinch, because to them, I am. Not to Sophie, not to you, but to their idea of how the world's supposed to work. The day unfolds like a storm gathering speed. Several charity board members who had remained silent after the gala now send formal letters announcing their resignation due to recent events and concerns about public perception. One longtime business partner of Alexander's calls to regretfully suspend a joint venture. In the span of hours, the consequences begin to move from the realm of gossip into the realm of tangible loss. Yet Alexander remains calm in a way that unnerves even Elena. He calls in his core management team for a closed-door meeting, outlining strategies not just to weather the PR fallout, but to redirect it entirely. They want scandal, he tells them. We'll give them a cause instead. Meanwhile, the online discourse spirals. The interview clip where Elena says, "My worth isn't determined by where I was born," goes viral, turned into both a rallying cry and a target. Some post it alongside heartfelt messages about dignity and respect. Others mock it, twisting the words into cruel memes. That afternoon, Elena receives an email from a journalist she recognizes as one of the more ruthless tabloid writers. The subject line reads, "Your turn for the real truth." The body is short, almost smug. "We know there's more to your story. Talk to us before someone else does." She doesn't reply, but the message lingers in her mind like a splinter. By evening, a new wave of headlines hits. Anonymous sources claiming that Elena has been angling for influence in the Grant household for months, that she's been advising Alexander on business matters well outside her role. The claims are absurd, but the repetition makes them sound plausible to those already inclined to believe the worst. In the kitchen, Mrs. Langford shakes her head as she scrolls through her phone. "They can't stand that you didn't apologize for existing," she mutters. Elena forces a smile, but inside, she feels the weight of every uninvited opinion pressing down on her. That night, Alexander finds her sitting in the nursery long after Sophie has fallen asleep, the faint hum of the white noise machine filling the quiet. He leans against the doorway, watching her for a moment before saying, "They're loud because they're afraid. And people who are afraid will do anything to protect what they think they own, even if it's just the story they've been telling themselves." She looks up at him, her voice steady despite the fatigue. "So what do? We take the story from them," he says simply, "and we make it so they can't take it back." The next morning, Alexander's strategy begins to take shape. He arranges for Elena to appear at a press-covered charity event, not as staff, but as a guest and active participant. The cause is one close to her heart, a program providing education and support for children in underserved communities, something she'd quietly volunteered with before working for the grants. When they arrive, cameras flash, but this time the coverage focuses less on speculation and more on the cause itself. Elena speaks briefly at the podium, her voice clear as she talks about opportunity and the power of stability for a child's development. She doesn't mention the tabloids or the backlash, but every word is a counterpunch to the narrative being built against her. The event sparks a ripple effect. Photos of Elena with the program's children circulate online, drawing praise from unexpected quarters. A few of the harsher critics pivot, grudgingly acknowledging her sincerity. Others double down, accusing her of using charity as a smokescreen. But by the end of the week, one thing is undeniable. She's no longer just a passive subject in someone else's headline. That night, as they drive back to the estate, Alexander glances over at her. Alexander opens it in the study, while Elena stands near the window, the winter light cold against her skin. Inside is a single-page letter on the heavy cream stationery of the Grant Family Trust, the governing body that controls a significant portion of Alexander's inherited assets. The language is polite, but the meaning is blunt. The Trust Board demands that Alexander take immediate steps to mitigate reputational harm caused by ongoing public controversies. It doesn't name Elena directly, but the implication is as clear as if it had been written in bold. The letter ends with a thinly veiled threat. Failure to comply could result in a vote to restrict his access to certain funds and influence within the trust. Alexander reads it once, twice, then sets it down without a word. Elena feels the tension in the room tighten like a wire. "So they're giving you an ultimatum," she says evenly. "Either you get rid of me, or they start cutting you out." "They won't say it that way," he replies, "but yes, that's exactly what they mean." She waits for him to say what he's going to do, but instead he pours himself a drink and takes a long swallow, as though bracing for impact. "They think I'll choose money over people," he says finally, "because that's what they've always done." The day turns into a blur of quiet but deliberate movement. Alexander's assistant begins compiling records, financial statements, meeting notes, correspondence between the trust and its board members. Calls come in from allies offering discreet support, and from others offering not-so-discreet warnings about career suicide if he pushes back. Elena spends most of the afternoon with Sophie, the child's laughter a strange contrast to the undercurrent of looming conflict in the house. But her mind is elsewhere, running through every possible outcome of the trust threat. That evening, over dinner in the private dining room, Alexander lays out his plan. "We can fight this," he says, "but it won't be clean. They'll drag us both through hearings, depositions, maybe even court. It could take months, years, and they'll use every bit of that time to try to break you. Then we don't give them the time," Elena says. "We force their hand before they can settle into their game." Her words spark something in him, the corner of his mouth lifting just slightly. "You're suggesting we go on the offensive." "I'm suggesting we make them show their cards now," she replies. "If they want to use my existence as a weapon, let's make them admit it in the open." The next day, Alexander requests an emergency meeting of the trust board. It's held in the city, in a conference room lined with dark wood paneling and oil paintings of long-dead grand patriarchs staring down from gilded frames. Elena doesn't sit in the meeting, but she's there in the hallway, her presence a quiet statement of defiance. Inside, the air is thick with the polite hostility of people who would rather stab with smiles than with knives. Alexander begins without preamble, laying the letter on the table for everyone to see. "You've made your position clear," he says. "Now here's mine. I'm not removing Elena from my household, and I'm not apologizing for her presence in my life or in my daughter's." One of the older board members, a man named Whitmore, whose family fortune predates the Civil War, leans back in his chair with a smirk. "You're risking decades of carefully managed legacy for a personal choice." "No," Alexander replies, "I'm protecting my legacy from people who think it's theirs to control." The conversation turns into a tug-of-war of implications and veiled threats, each side testing how far the other is willing to go. At one point, a younger board member suggests a compromise. Elena could remain employed, but with her role redefined, to keep her out of public view. Alexander shuts it down with a single sentence. "If you think hiding her will solve your problem, you don't understand the problem." The meeting ends without resolution, but not without effect. By refusing to yield, Alexander forces the board into a position they hadn't anticipated. Either escalate their threat to a formal vote, risking public exposure of their motives, or back down for now. As they leave, Whitmore passes Elena in the hallway, giving her a look that's equal parts curiosity and contempt. "Enjoy your moment," he says quietly. "They never last." Elena doesn't respond, but her jaw tightens. Back at the estate that night, the atmosphere is electric, not with relief, but with the awareness that a larger battle is now inevitable. Alexander sits in the library, staring into the fire, his glass untouched on the table beside him. "You should know," he says, "if they push this to a vote, we could lose more than money. They'll try to strip influence, control, anything they think will hurt me. And they'll make you the justification for all of it. Then I'll be the justification," she says, her voice steady. "Better that than being silent while they decide who's allowed to matter." She carefully lays Sophie in her crib, tucks the blanket under her chin, and moves toward the hallway, listening. By the time she reaches the top of the stairs, she can see the front doors standing wide open, the winter air spilling in, and standing in the foyer are Margaret and two other board members, Whitmore among them, their coats still dusted with snow. Alexander is facing them, his stance rigid, his voice controlled but edged with steel. "You don't just show up here without calling," he says, but Margaret steps forward, ignoring the rebuke. "You've left us no choice," she replies. "The board has voted. If you do not remove Ms. Brooks from your household by the end of the week, the trust will proceed with full action to strip your voting rights and freeze your discretionary accounts." Whitmore chimes in, his tone smug. "We offered you compromise. You rejected it. Now we're done negotiating." Elena descends the stairs slowly, her presence drawing their attention. Margaret's eyes narrow. "This isn't about you personally," she says, her voice dripping with insincerity. "It's about the image we've worked decades to protect." Elena stops at the base of the stairs, meeting her gaze evenly. "Then maybe your image is the problem." Alexander's hand twitches as if to caution her, but he doesn't stop her from speaking. Margaret's lips press into a thin line, but it's Whitmore who responds. "Your defiance is costing him millions. You think you're proving something, but you're just proving why you don't belong in his world." Alexander steps between them, his voice low but lethal. "She belongs in my world because I say she does. And if you think I'll trade her for a bigger balance sheet, you don't know me at all." The board members exchange a look that says they've already decided this war is worth the cost. Without another word, they turn and leave, the sound of the heavy doors closing echoing through the foyer like a final verdict. The house feels colder after they're gone, as if the snow outside has seeped into the walls. Alexander runs a hand through his hair, pacing. "They'll move fast now," he says. "They've been waiting for this moment, and they think they've cornered us. So we move faster," Elena says. "If they're going to make this public, we take it public first, on our terms." That night, Alexander makes calls to his most trusted allies, people who owe him favors or share his distaste for the trust's suffocating control. At the same time, Elena begins drafting a statement, not a defensive one, but a declaration. She writes about her work, her care for Sophie, her commitment to the household, and the deeper truth beneath the headlines, that her presence is not an accident or an indulgence, but a deliberate choice rooted in trust and mutual respect. Alexander reads it and nods. "This isn't just a response," he says. "It's a gauntlet." The following day, they set the plan in motion. Alexander's media team arranges a prime-time interview with one of the few journalists he trusts, a woman known for cutting through pretense and exposing hypocrisy. When the cameras roll, Alexander sits beside Elena, not behind her or apart from her, and speaks first. "There's been a lot of talk about reputation, about legacy," he begins. "Let me be clear, a legacy built on exclusion isn't worth protecting." He outlines the board's actions without naming names, then turns the microphone to Elena, who speaks plainly about dignity, choice, and the difference between belonging somewhere and being tolerated. The interview is raw and unscripted, and by the time it ends, the internet is already ablaze. Clips of Alexander saying she belongs because I say she does circulate alongside Elena's line. "Belonging is not a gift someone gives you, it's a truth you live." Support pours in from unexpected corners. Business leaders, civil rights advocates, even a few members of the Grant extended family who had long resented the board's power. But the backlash is just as fierce. The trust's allies accuse Alexander of recklessness and Elena of opportunism. Financial analysts predict a steep drop in the value of certain Grant holdings if the dispute continues. In the midst of this storm, Alexander receives a call from an old friend in the political sphere, warning him that some board members are now lobbying regulators to investigate his business dealings. "They want to make this about you being unfit to lead," the friend says, "and they're willing to burn everything to prove it." That night, the weight of it all presses down harder than ever. Alexander sits in the library, the fire casting shadows across his face, and says quietly, "If this goes wrong, they could take everything. Houses, accounts, even the company. I can rebuild, but they'll make sure you get dragged through the wreckage too." Elena sits across from him, her voice steady. The morning after the snowstorm, the estate feels like it's holding its breath. The interview has ignited a wildfire of attention, and the Grant Family Trust can no longer hide behind closed doors. Elena wakes early, not because of worry, but because she knows today will decide everything. Downstairs, Alexander is already dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, his expression calm but sharp, as if carved from stone. On the table between them sits a folder, the final weapon in their fight. Inside are documents, records, and statements from former associates of the trust, all detailing the subtle but deliberate ways the board has used wealth to enforce exclusion for generations. Some are small, almost petty, charitable grants withheld from organizations they deemed not in alignment with family values. Others are massive business decisions designed to keep entire communities economically dependent or excluded. The evidence is not illegal in the narrowest sense, but in the court of public opinion, it is damning. At 10 o'clock sharp, they arrive at the Grandhurst Hotel downtown, where the trust has called an emergency public meeting to address the unfortunate situation. The ballroom is packed, board members on a raised dais, reporters lined along the back, and an audience of donors, business leaders, and curious onlookers buzzing with speculation. Elena can feel eyes tracking her as she walks beside Alexander, every whisper slicing the air like glass. Margaret sits at the center of the dais, a thin smile stretched across her face. Whitmore is to her left, flipping through a folder with deliberate disinterest. The meeting begins with Margaret reading a carefully crafted statement about unity and restoring the dignity of the family's legacy. Words that sound benign, but are designed to corner Alexander into stepping back without making the board look like villains. When she finishes, Alexander rises, holding the folder. "I agree with one thing," he says, his voice carrying to the farthest corners of the room. "This is about dignity, but not the kind you're talking about." He opens the folder and begins laying out the evidence, piece by piece. He doesn't shout, doesn't dramatize. He simply tells the truth, explaining each document's context and the harm it caused, both to individuals and to the family's supposed reputation. With each page he sets down on the table before the audience, the room shifts, first murmurs, then silence, then a cold, focused attention that even the board can feel. Margaret tries to interrupt, but he cuts her off with the same precision she once used on him. "You brought this into the open," he says, "and now it's open. You want to talk about protecting a legacy? Legacies aren't built on control, they're built on courage. And I won't let mine be built on fear of who deserves to be here." Then, without missing a beat, he gestures to Elena, inviting her to speak. She steps forward, the microphone feeling heavier than it should, but her voice steady. "You can strip accounts. You can take titles. You can cut ties with people who refuse to bend to you. But you cannot decide for someone else whether they belong. That's not yours to give, and it's not yours to take." Her words hang in the air, resonating far beyond the walls of the ballroom. The silence that follows is not the silence of dismissal. It's the silence of impact. Even some of the trust's most loyal supporters glance away, unwilling to meet her gaze. The board calls for a recess, retreating to a side room while the audience breaks into knots of discussion. The tension is electric. When the board returns 20 minutes later, Margaret's smile is gone. She announces that in light of recent developments, the board will not proceed with revoking Alexander's voting rights or freezing his accounts. It's not a surrender, not officially, but in every way that matters, they have backed down. There's no applause, no dramatic outburst, just the slow realization that the power dynamic in the room has shifted. The meeting adjourns, and as the crowd begins to disperse, Whitmore approaches Alexander and Elena. His voice is low, almost grudging. "You've won this round." But it changes everything. They won't forget. Alexander's answer is simple: "Good." Outside, the winter air is crisp, the snow on the ground sparkling in the pale sunlight. Cameras flash as they step onto the sidewalk, but Elena doesn't shy away from them this time. Instead, she looks straight into one lens and lets herself smile, not the smile of victory, but of relief and resolve. Back in the car, Alexander takes her hand, the folder now resting on the seat between them. "You realize," he says, "we didn't just protect what we had. We changed it." She squeezes his hand. "Then let's make sure it stays changed." Weeks later, the ripples from that day are still spreading. Charities once ignored by the trust begin receiving funding. Business partnerships long stalled by prejudice quietly resume. And while the board remains as calculating as ever, they tread more carefully now, aware that the shield of secrecy they once relied on has cracks that won't close. For Elena, the lesson is clear. She didn't win because she had the louder voice or the deeper pockets. She won because she refused to be silent, even when silence would have been easier. And for Alexander, the victory is not just keeping control of his legacy, but redefining it so it can't be used as a weapon against the people he values. On a quiet evening, months later, Elena rocks Sophie to sleep in the same chair where, so long ago, Alexander first tried to take her from her arms. The child's breathing is soft and even, her small fingers curled around the fabric of Elena's sweater. She realizes then that this moment of safety, of belonging, is the true victory. Not the headlines, not the grudging respect, not even the survival of their position. The real win is that Sophie will grow up in a home where worth isn't decided by the whispers of a boardroom, but by the truth of how you treat the people in it. And that is something no trust, no wealth, and no threat can take away. The end. If this story touched you, please give a like and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories like this. I'd love to know what you think about the plot. Did any part surprise or move you? Let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Your support means a lot and helps us keep sharing stories that matter.